A nuclear weapon, a hydrogen bomb. Exploded over a big city and it will blot out the lives of maybe 1 million people. There are tens of thousands of weapons like this in the world now, and they're every bit as real as you and me, the people they're designed to destroy. This film is about nuclear war, and you may find it offensive, but this is a very offensive weapon.
The Nagasaki bomb, which is large here, and they call it the Fat Man, was more complicated than the Little Boy. It was an implosion-type weapon.
Nobody wants a nuclear war, yet we all conspire to make it possible. Most of us only through our votes and our taxes, but there are millions of people who actively collaborate in preparing for it. Theirs is a world from which the rest of us are excluded, except as potential victims. We are the mega-dead.
Each country, there is a tiny group of people who are obsessed with the development of the techniques of utter destruction, who claim that these are necessary for the defense of the country, who acquire enormous sums of money by regular means and a great deal more, which is concealed from Congress or Parliament.
These men are warriors, the last of an ancient breed. They're obsolete now because war has been taken over by much more dangerous people. Those who sit in cockpits and missile silos and above all in offices and plan and practice for the destruction of the world. In our century, total war at the highest level has practically ceased to be a military operation at all. The main targets of warfare are no longer other soldiers, but the distant cities whose civilians labor to produce the weapons of war. We've created new institutions to wage this new kind of warfare, and like all human organizations, their strongest motive is to ensure their own survival, even if their business is preparing the way for nuclear war. These are yesterday's ultimate weapons. A quarter century ago, these bombers and the men who flew them were America's main method for destroying the Soviet Union. After about a decade at the top of the strategic heap, these bombers were replaced by newer technology, and they wound up here in this Air Force boneyard in the Arizona desert. It's customary in places like this to reflect mournfully on the speed of technological change and the cost of keeping up with it, all of which is true. But these bombers also carry another message, that technology changes, but institutions persist. The romantic image of military flying is the fighter pilot, but for 50 years now, the business end of air forces has been the bombers, and driving bombers has never been romantic. Their main job is killing helpless civilians in cities. Yet the men who fly bombers are not monsters. They're perfectly ordinary people with kids and mortgages and lawnmowers. Have a good ride?
Oh, good ride. Hard ride. Here we are, back at the end of the day. My airplane coming in like a broken dinosaur, one wing up, one wing down.
How'd it go?
It went real well. We flew everything as scheduled, got everything accomplished. We made a low-level pass over an Army site to show the troops the colors and the firepower of the U.S., and we did that, and the mission's complete, 7.5 hours. I'm second generation Air Force. I'm second generation B-52. My father was one of the first groups of individuals who was trained in the B-52 when it was a glamorous weapon system. I get a lot of enjoyment out of flying. I like to be able to say I am a pilot. When it all boils down to it, yeah, patriotism is a big part of it. I like the idea that I'm serving the country on a bigger spectrum, helping to defend the free world. And I feel like I have a job of worth.
How did you feel when you first found out that he'd be a B-52 bomber pilot?
I can't understand war in the first place. In fact, it makes me want to cry because, you know, when the thing with Iran happened and everybody said we should just go bomb them, they didn't understand that those people, even though they were Iranians, had little 2-year-olds just like we do. And if I thought somebody did that to us, it's such a horrible waste, you know, and I don't really like the idea that that's what Scott would have to do. But I know that he would only have to do it if it became necessary and something that we loved was threatened. But I try not, really honestly, I try not to think about it because it's not a pleasant thought.
The world learned just how unpleasant bombing could be on the morning of August 6, 1945. Until then, bombers were merely one more weapon in a long list of new technological devices for killing people. For Colonel Paul Tibbets, the mission he flew on that morning was different, but only because of the kind of bomb he was carrying.
I saw a perfectly outlined city, clear in every detail coming in. The city roughly was about 4 miles in diameter. By that time, we were at our bombing altitude of 32,000 feet. The navigator came up looking over his shoulder. He says, yes, that's Hiroshima, there's no doubt about it. We were so well on the target that the bombardier says, I can't do anything, there's nothing to do. He said, it's just sitting there.
We were not expecting an air raid, but high up in the sky I heard a B-29, an American bomber. I thought it was strange.
The bomb left the airplane, and at that particular time, all 3 airplanes then did this very tight turn. Even though it was bright sunshine, it was evident by the brilliance of the flash that something unusual had happened, and obviously it was the bomb exploding.
If I describe it, it was as if the sun had crashed and exploded. Yellow fireballs were splashing down.
After the weapon had exploded, I couldn't see any city down there. But what I saw was a tremendous area covered by, and the only way I could describe it, a boiling black mass.
It was hell. There were so many injured people that there was almost no room to walk. This was only a mile from where the bomb fell. People's clothes had been blown off and their bodies burned by the heat rays. They looked as if they had strips of rags hanging from them. They had water blisters which had already burst, and their skins hung in tatters. I saw people whose intestines were already hanging out of their bodies. Some had lost their eyes. Some had their backs torn open so you could see their backbones inside. They were all asking for water.
3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki.
I was lying in the street, which was shaking like an earthquake. A little while later, I raised my head and saw that the children who had been playing nearby had been blown away like dust. After everything calmed down, I looked up and looked back at the way I had come. Almost all the houses had been destroyed. The skin on my left arm was hanging from shoulder to fingertips, like a rag. I touched my back and felt no clothes. I felt something slimy. It was my burnt skin. I went to the mountain shelter and asked the people there to cut the hanging skin from my left arm. Afterwards, as there were no hospitals left in the city of Nagasaki, I was taken by train to a school somewhere outside Nagasaki.
These are pictures of Mr. Taniguchi in the hospital where he spent 18 months being treated for his burns. For the American government, dropping the bomb seemed a logical way to end a bloody war, but many of the scientists who had built it were already having grave doubts. Years later, Robert Oppenheimer, one of the scientists, could still not talk calmly about the first atomic test.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
When Oppenheimer went to see President Truman after the bombs were dropped, saying that he felt he had blood on his hands, Truman dismissed him as a crybaby. "I hope for some sort of peace," Truman had written in his diary, "but I fear that machines are ahead of morals by some centuries. It's certainly a good thing for the world that Hitler's crowd or Stalin's did not discover the atomic bomb. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful." The Russians, however, worried about what the atomic bomb might be useful for, as this Soviet propaganda film shows.
The new United States President, Harry Truman, spoke of peace and justice. He spoke of a long-lasting peace, a peace based on common sense by the will of God. But precisely on that day, he was told that American scientists were completing work on a weapon more horrible than anything mankind had ever known. And Truman said with joy, "Now I'll have a big stick for those guys." That is, for us, Soviet people. President Truman had obtained a monstrous weapon and started his gamble.
In fact, the Russians were so appalled by nuclear weapons that they promptly built their own. They had already started working on them back in 1943. It just took them a little longer.
There was the first Soviet atomic test in 1949. It wasn't really a surprise. Most people, after our own success in 1945, did predict that the Soviets would produce a nuclear bomb in 4 or 5 years. However, it turns out that most of those people continued to think it would be 4 or 5 years. Each year, as the years went by, they continued to think it'll be 4 or 5 years. So when it finally happened, it was a surprise.
The lethal A-bomb is wheeled, carefully screened, toward the B-29 that is to carry it to...
Despite the Soviet bomb, North America stayed relatively safe for a long time. Only a few Russian bombers were likely to get through. So for at least a decade after 1945, nuclear weapons were seen by the U.S. government as a good thing for our side, and each atomic test was treated by official sources as an occasion for rejoicing.
As scientists plot experimental programs designed to furnish data on radioactive rays, flash burns, and blast effects of the mighty atom bomb. Operation Crossroads has begun. The bomb is away. sky, the awe-inspiring cloud billows and surges, blotting out the destruction below. There is no earthquake, no tidal wave or other catastrophe to justify the fears of some.
But the Soviet bomb did start a new kind of arms race. The U.S. resumed testing in 1951, and in less than 3 years exploded 42 bombs, including the first hydrogen bomb. What all these bombs were for, of course, was to stop the Russians. As far as the West was concerned, the Soviet Union had already taken over Eastern Europe, and there were deep fears that Western Europe would be next. But things looked very different from the Soviet Union's point of view. Russians are a bit paranoid about the rest of the world, but their history gives them lots of reasons for feeling that way. Living where they do, with no natural frontiers, they've suffered more and worse invasions than almost anybody else. So in 1945, after the second German invasion in a quarter century had devastated their country, the men who ran the Kremlin, Stalin used to live and work in that building there, began installing loyal communist regimes in all the countries of Eastern Europe that lay between them and Germany. I'm not defending their actions, but it was pretty obvious to any Russian that the purpose was to create a buffer zone against any future invasion from the West. An essentially defensive measure, in other words. But that wasn't at all clear to the West, who saw all this as the prelude to the Soviet conquest of Western Europe. The West couldn't, or at least wouldn't, spend the money to match the huge Soviet military machine in Europe. Instead, the United States put its faith in a cheap and nasty solution called massive retaliation.
It made sense once in that as you had a nuclear superiority, the theory was, as soon as the other side established beyond doubt that they were invading, you then let loose the American strategic nuclear arm and blasted, incinerated, irradiated enough of the people on the other side to make them stop what they were doing, whatever it was. Well, of course, that was the raving of a feverish child. You know, I can't put it any higher than that, although I've lost a lot of friends by saying this, particularly among the airmen, close enough. They're very difficult to persuade.
But of course, massive retaliation made the airmen the most important armed force, and they gloried in the role. Simply destroying countries has been child's play since nuclear weapons came into the world. These bombers were able to obliterate the Soviet Union 25 years ago, and they could still do it today. But bombers have one major handicap. They take many hours to reach their targets. When the technology of war changes drastically, there's always a lag while strategy catches up, and it's in the transitional period that the danger of war is most acute. The first and most dangerous change that the world has lived through since 1945 came when long-range missiles were beginning to replace bombers as the primary method of delivering nuclear weapons. The turning point was the Cuban crisis of 1962, when Moscow tried to hurry this change up by sneaking some of its early short-range nuclear missiles into Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States, and the Americans caught them at it before the missiles were ready.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, all ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The Soviet gamble didn't work, as they really were still enormously inferior to the United States in nuclear weapons. The American Navy blockaded Cuba, the Russians backed down, and their missiles in Cuba never became operational. Instead, they were forced to withdraw them.
The United States humbled the Russians in the early 60s over the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians swore that would never happen to them again. So they went on a big arms building kick, and they have achieved somewhat near parity with the United States, whatever that term means.
Я думаю, что кубинский кризис I don't think that the Cuban crisis influenced in any way the development of strategic forces, of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Why? Because by this time, 1962, we had ballistic missiles, and so did the Americans.
By the middle 60s, Russian strategic forces had the ability to reach out from the Soviet homeland itself and devastate the entire United States. But they did not have the ability to stop the U.S. from striking back. The era of mutual deterrence had arrived.
Basically, what's been happening since World War II is that if you look at it from the American perspective, what you find is that immediately after the war, we were invulnerable. A decade later, we were no longer completely invulnerable. The Russians could have hit us then with a few atomic bombs, produced a few million casualties. 10 years after that, they were in a position to produce tens of millions of casualties. Today, they're in a position to just simply wipe us out quantitatively. And there is no defense against that. All you can do is deter that from happening by threatening an unacceptable revenge. But you can't stop it from happening.
In a curious way, the arrival of mutual deterrence made both sides believe that a nuclear war was less likely, as if nobody would deliberately start a war in which they were bound to be destroyed. You can still find the old fallout shelters scattered around America's big cities, but it's 15 years now since anybody paid much attention to them. Partly it was because the peaceful outcome of the Cuban crisis convinced the public that both sides knew how to control the risks. Nuclear war really did seem less likely. So in all the basements and underground parking garages that had been turned into makeshift shelters in the 50s, the emergency food and medical supplies gradually moldered away. In any case, by the mid-60s, the U.S. government no longer worried about shelters. American strategic theory for a while actually held that it was not only practically impossible to protect the civilian population in a nuclear war, but that it was wrong and dangerous even to try. Nuclear war would only be unthinkable if the people on each side were helpless hostages to the other side's nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD for short.
But it only seems mad if you're outside the system that's dedicated to making the future safe for nuclear war. If you work inside the system, like these young men at a U.S. Air Force missile base near Knob Noster, Missouri, it all seems perfectly logical.
Okay, let's go to the missile launch checklist. I'm there. At step 1, we need to insert the launch keys. Let's go get them.
6 or 8 times a month, they sit deep underground in their silos for 24 hours, waiting for the order to launch their missiles. And once a month, they simulate going to war.
And insert the keys and strap into each chair. My key is inserted.
No detail is forgotten, right down to strapping themselves into the chairs so they won't be thrown away from their control panels by the shock if Russian nuclear weapons explode overhead.
I'm strapped in. And I am also. Step 1 is accomplished. Check. And a PLCA is required. 2 through 8. 2 and 3 are not required. I agree. PLCA launch option, required number. Number's in.
In one sense, these men who control the missiles of Strategic Air Command are today's real frontline soldiers. Yet I doubt that Alexander or Napoleon or even General George Patton would have thought they were soldiers at all. They don't use personal weapons, and they would never lay eyes on the enemies they kill. They take their orders from machines, and they pass them on to other machines.
Program select switch.
In fact, their job, which lies at the very heart of today's military strategy, differs in no significant respect, apart from its possible consequences, from that of the duty engineer at a hydroelectric power station.
The enable switch is enabled. This time the command is being transmitted to all missiles in the squadron. Yeah, let's wait for indications. Okay.
When you're waiting for indications, what does that mean?
The launch boat, the Enable Command has been sent out. However, we are waiting for that alarm number 2 to notify us that the missiles have accepted the command.
Okay, and I've got sorties enabling.
Check.
So we're ready for step 35. Key turn and commit time.
Roger.
And I show us in a good window, so let's go ahead and commit.
Okay, we'll commit. We'll simultaneously rotate both keys, and this will send out the launch commands to the missiles to allow them to launch.
Ready on my mark?
I'm ready.
3, 2, 1. Mark. Hold for 5 seconds.
This is the way the world will end.
And release.
I show key turn is accomplished.
And I've got another alarm to let us know that the launch command went through.
Check.
Automatic from there on?
At that point, we're hoping that another crew within the squadron is going to be turning keys the same way that we did. It takes 2 crews turning keys at the same time to actually launch the missiles. We work on a 2-boat system, so the one boat will send a launch command. The missiles will wait for a second launch boat from another launch control center before they will actually launch. After that, it's automatic.
How would you feel if you ever had to do it for real?
Well, we're trained so highly in our recurring training that we take every month in simulators like this, so that if we actually had to do it, it would be an almost automatic thing.
You wouldn't be thinking about it at the time?
There wouldn't be time for any reflection until after we turned the keys and waited for the indications.
Would there be reflection then, do you think?
I should think so, yes.
Do you think it would bother you to turn keys for real?
No, it wouldn't. It's, as Mike said earlier, my commander, it's automatic, kind of a reflex. You really don't have time to think about it.
To be fair, young men in missile silos are not paid to think about it. But the senior officers and civilians who are haven't always been ruled by logic either. For one thing, practically every branch of the U.S. forces has tried to get into the strategic nuclear business because that's the big league.
Officer of the deck, man battle stations missile. Man battle stations missile, aye, sir. Man battle stations missile.
Herbert York has been in on the resulting battle almost from the start.
Yeah, in the immediate post-war years, the Army was developing rockets, and the Air Force was thinking about long-range delivery systems, but was focusing on airplanes and cruise missiles, winged cruise missiles. And so the Army got the jump on the Air Force with respect to these developments. After the invention of the hydrogen bomb, it became evident to the Air Force that long-range rockets probably were the optimum way to deliver them, or at least a very good way, competitive with airplanes. And so they immediately initiated long-range rocket programs of their own. So this led to a head-on competition between the Army and the Air Force. The Navy also came to believe that the delivery of thermonuclear weapons was somehow the wave of the future. And so the Polaris submarine system was invented and pushed as yet another way of accomplishing the same objective.
York did manage to cancel the Army's long-range missile program, but everybody else went ahead. And pretty soon they came up with a justification for why so many different kinds of nuclear forces are needed to do the same job. It's called the triad.
And it's ridiculous because it's just something that grew like Topsy. The Navy was going ahead with its submarines, the Air Force was going ahead with its bombers and its land-based missiles. Then they got the happy idea, well, there are 3 of us, we'll call it a triad. But this Holy Trinity triad has assumed proportions such that no one can challenge it. Anybody who suggests cutting out one sounds like he's going to take one of the legs out of the stool.
Call is required, it is.
However, as Soviet missiles got more accurate, the possibility arose that the Air Force's Minuteman missiles might be wiped out in their fixed silos by a surprise attack. If all you want is the ability to destroy the Russians in retaliation, that doesn't matter, because most of America's bombers and missile-firing submarines, being mobile, would survive. But it's a big problem for the Air Force, which might have to get out of the missile business.
The fact that we do not merely have that we don't have just land-based missiles, but have these other two types, does allow us to take our time about resolving the questions that are being posed by these improvements in the Soviet land-based forces. Some people probably are too frantic about finding a solution, and the philosophy of having the three kinds of systems, that is the notion that we must have some land-based missile as a follow-on to the Minuteman, probably is distorting our ability to really rationally think through what should be done next.
What the Air Force needed to stay in the missile business was a new generation of mobile land-based missiles, the fabled MX, and it found some useful allies here in Washington. In public, American strategy remained mutual assured destruction all through the 60s and 70s, but the planners here at the Pentagon were never really certain themselves that MAD would prevent war. And if war came anyway, they wanted more options than just blowing the world up in one go. So ever since the early 60s, the actual U.S. war plans, the strategic targeting doctrines, have been evolving towards selective strikes against Soviet military targets, city avoidance, all sorts of ways of fighting a fairly limited war using nuclear weapons, in the hope that if war came, the Soviets would play by the same rules and not attack American cities right away.
One of the most important myths is that if nuclear war ever starts, it will escalate to wipe out the world. Now, that may be true. I don't know. But I think it is at least as plausible, from pure logic, that once a few nuclear weapons go off, and we're talking again about the homelands in Russia and the United States, people are going to think, my Lord, let's stop and think a minute. And the incentives to de-escalation may prove to be just as great as the incentives to escalation. They may prove to be greater. And people may decide to go to the bargaining table.
The Russians say that they don't believe in limited nuclear war, but then they would, wouldn't they? The greatest problem in discussing nuclear strategy is that nobody knows what the Russians really think. I remember once in Moscow walking up Frunze Street to see if I could say that in front of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, but they wouldn't even admit it was there, let alone allow me to film it. They were quite upset that I'd even been in Frunze Street. Now, here in the United States, you can find out what the strategists are really thinking, though they don't advertise it, and it makes Americans look bad by comparison, because some of the thinking is pretty chilling. But if you look at the weapons the Soviets build, it's pretty obvious that they've also moved beyond simple deterrence, and they're playing around with ways of fighting a limited nuclear war. Americans are just slightly more open about it.
In the United States, you can actually trace the way the armed forces have climbed aboard the limited nuclear war bandwagon. There's not much reason to ask for fancy new weapons if your only job is to kill all your enemy's people, which is what mutual assured destruction is all about. Limited nuclear war, on the other hand, puts no limits on the numbers and kinds of weapons you need. The target list expands endlessly to include missile silos, command bunkers, oil refineries, tank factories. In fact, it's now up to 40,000 potential targets. The story of how the Air Force used the doctrine of limited nuclear war to solve its little credibility problem with land-based missiles, and finally got the MX missile seen here in early testing, is instructive.
The Air Force started by arguing that its existing missiles are becoming vulnerable to a Soviet surprise attack, which is true if the Russians ever actually dared to make that kind of attack and didn't worry about the thousands of nuclear warheads that'd strike back at them from America's invulnerable submarines. Trouble is, of course, the obvious answer to the Air Force argument is that if the land-based missiles are becoming vulnerable, we should send them all out to sea. So the Air Force then had to find some reason why land-based missiles were indispensable. And the only significant difference between them and submarine-launched missiles is that land-based missiles can be somewhat more accurate. Most people might not think that's very important, not when you're talking about nuclear weapons that can devastate whole cities, but you have to work with what you've got.
Therefore, the Air Force had to find targets for which accuracy was vital. The most plausible ones are the silos in which the Russians keep their land-based missiles. Even nuclear weapons have to explode very close by to destroy missile silos. Now, there'd be no point in destroying Russian silos once the missiles have been launched, and you can't argue in public for a U.S. first strike capability. So the Air Force drew upon the developing doctrine of limited nuclear war to invent a scenario in which at least some Soviet silos would still contain missiles after Moscow had launched a limited nuclear attack on American missiles. Then the highly accurate MX missiles, which would survive because they were mobile, could strike back right away to destroy the Russian land-based missiles that Moscow had held back to use as blackmail. This is called prompt counterforce targeting.
The Air Force, of course, wanted, quote, to modernize their elements of the triad. And any service is always interested in something called modernization and gets restless because the weapon systems that they have are old or obsolescent or both. The triad is desirable because each of the components performs a special function. The special function that the ICBMs provide us with is availability, accuracy, controllability that exceeds that of either of the other legs of the forces. If the Soviets have prompt counterforce, at this time, the only way we can acquire an equivalent prompt counterforce is through ICBM.
Mind you, nobody's ever promptly fired a missile across the pole. Just as well, really, but it does mean that nobody actually knows just how accurate the missiles would be on that particular flight path. So all the claims about missiles being able to drop their warheads practically on top of the other side's silos rest on pretty shaky foundations. Besides, the MX isn't going to be mobile after all. They're now stuffing it down old Minuteman silos, which kind of undermines the Air Force's original arguments about vulnerability. Still, it's big, almost 250,000 pounds. It has 10 separate warheads, and it belongs to the Air Force, not the Navy. The one positive thing you can say about all this is that it's finally brought limited nuclear war out of the closet. It's now official and public policy that the kind of nuclear war the Air Force used to justify its new missiles, in which each side would pick off a few hundred of the other side's missiles while neatly avoiding cities, then pick up the hotline and stop the war, is a real strategic option. The strategy was set out most clearly in Presidential Directive 59 in 1980. As the Defense Department later told Congress, our planning must provide a continuum of options ranging from the use of small numbers of strategic and/or theater nuclear weapons aimed at narrowly defined targets to the employment of large portions of our nuclear forces against a broad spectrum of targets. Plans for the controlled use of nuclear weapons should enable us to provide leverage for a negotiated termination of the fighting. A limited nuclear war, the kind you could theoretically fight without being exterminated, is now seen as a real strategic possibility. At least the theorists and those who control the nuclear weapons see it that way. Practical soldiers don't believe a word of it.
To my mind, the ultimate obscenity is all-out nuclear war. And anything that tends towards it is something which makes me very uneasy. And in this connection, I'm very uneasy about the tendency to talk now in terms of a limited nuclear war, a winnable nuclear war, in the mistaken belief, as I believe it to be, that once you start it, you can stop it before it goes the whole way. I don't believe you can.
Считаю, что никакого ограниченного применения ядерного оружия...
I don't think there can be any limited use of nuclear weapons.
Стоит только вспыхнуть...
If a nuclear war starts, after the first nuclear explosion, the war will escalate to a total nuclear war. This is the logic of modern war and the character of modern weaponry.
But if you believe in limited nuclear war, you also have to believe in things like crisis relocation, a plan drawn up by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in which 145 million Americans who live in cities and near military bases would, in the few days before a nuclear war starts, all be moved to someplace else in the country that the authorities have decided is going to be safe.
course, for government agencies and senior officials, the plans are rather more elaborate. One of the places that figures in their plans is the Carey salt mine here in Hutchinson, Kansas.
Get off her, Julio. Hey, watch your mouth. I got something.
Digging out salt creates underground storage space, so Carey salt mine has a tenant. When underground vaults and storage started its business down here in 1959, nuclear war was in everybody's mind, and UVS made its living off that fear.
And at that time, the civil defense people told us that that it was required that you have 220 feet of overlay to sustain the largest bomb that they had at that time. Well, we're 650 feet deep. So I think that we could withstand a virtually direct hit and not affect the area down here. And yes, I'd come down here.
But do you have the supplies to live in? That's the real question.
Better here than there. I would make do.
What future archaeologists would find down here, apart from Mike Gingrich, is thousands of cartons of greasy restaurant receipts, kept for tax purposes, the original print of Gone with the Wind, and some very old bankers. U.S. government agencies are required by law to have emergency relocation sites. This is where the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City would reconstruct its records and start up the banking system again after a nuclear holocaust. The records are in the vault there, typewriters, emergency lighting system. It makes some kind of sense from the bank's point of view, I suppose, and it's relatively easy to protect bank records. But the main thing that would burn in a nuclear war is people, and they're much harder to protect. The Russian for civil defense is Gражданская оборона, but Russian cynics shorten it down to GROB. GROB is Russian for coffin. A whole bureaucratic empire has grown up here that bases itself on the pretense that Soviet citizens can be protected from a nuclear attack. It convinces some Western observers, mainly those who want to use it as an argument for still more Western nuclear warheads, but it doesn't convince Russians. What do you do when you hear the nuclear alert, asks a Russian. Put a sheet over your head and walk slowly to the cemetery, replies another. Why slowly? So you don't cause a panic. In Moscow, as in Washington, there are elaborate plans to protect the leaders, the generals, and the senior bureaucrats. After all, you could hardly have a war without them. But for the millions of ordinary Russians in this city and others, civil defense means simply evacuation, if there's time. Evacuation by bus, through railway stations like this, and for most people in long marching columns wending their way out beyond the suburbs, where if they're lucky, and it's the right time of year, they'll freeze to death in the open fields before the fallout gets them. Civil defense is silly and futile, but at least it's about trying to keep people alive. Nowhere does civil defense get even 1% of what we call defense budgets. The rest goes to inventing and building new and more efficient ways of killing people.
There is a kind of a technological exuberance that leads to solutions which are sometimes fancier than necessary, that include capabilities which may not be particularly important, but which involve, but which are very clever, and on occasion to provide solutions to problems that either don't exist at all or which have been presented in a very exaggerated form.
It's not just the fascination of the technicians and the scientists, of course. The push for new weapons also comes from industry, for which they can mean billions of dollars and millions of jobs.
We've made great big business out of preparing for war, big business out of the military. And whereas in the old days we used to have to plead with the Congress to give us some money for our clothing factory or our shipyard, now it's industries all over the country leaning on their congressmen, leaning on their senators, trying to get jobs and profits for the industries.
Things work differently in the Soviet Union. Here there's no private companies trying to sell fancy new weapons to the government. The Ministry of Defense and the government as a whole decide what the country can afford, and then it's other government departments that actually design and manufacture the weapons. There's no profit motive, no military-industrial complex here.
And yet things work exactly the same in the Soviet Union. The new weapons spew out just as fast, and the real driving force on both sides is people's desire to advance their careers. If you're a colonel in the Pentagon or the Soviet Defense Ministry and you want to become a general, you need to show success in getting your service more resources and weapons. If you're a scientist in Soviet or American defense industry, you get recognition by developing new weapons. And if you're an executive in a U.S. aerospace company or a bureaucrat in the Soviet Ministry of Heavy Machine Building, you get control over more resources. You climb up the career ladder, in other words, by bringing the scientists and the soldiers together.
In the United States, it's called the military-industrial complex. Here they call it the Metal Eaters Alliance. And it all comes down to the same damn thing.
These people are discussing how to cook their own goose. If you hold a senior command in the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces or the American Strategic Air Command, then you have to believe that nuclear weapons are a good thing, that they're about peace and not war. Otherwise, you might conclude that you're in the wrong job. But once you've made that basic act of faith, it can be a fascinating job with lots of responsibility and intellectual challenge, especially if you're a civilian defense analyst with free license to speculate.
I agree, sir.
Interestingly, the nuclear weapon does exactly what General Dyer predicted in 1921, first theorist of air power. And he said, you want three things when you bomb. You want some HE, which was all they had then, high explosives, or TNT. And you wanted some fire bombs with it to start fires. And you wanted some poison gas bombs to prevent people from putting out the fires. Now, if you look at a nuclear weapon, he could have been prescient.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
Obviously, no moderately ambitious great power could afford to be without such a weapon. Britain tested its first nuclear bomb in 1952. France was next in 1960, and China followed in 1964.
Other countries have just as much right, or as little, to threaten their neighbors with nuclear weapons as the great powers do. Other cities have just as much right to be incinerated. Take Jerusalem, for example. Israel, though it doesn't admit it in public, has had a number of nuclear weapons for about a decade now. India's actually tested what it tactfully called a nuclear explosive device. And so Pakistan and several Arab countries will feel strategically naked until they've developed nuclear weapons too.
For countries like this, just as for the superpowers during the Cuban crisis, the most dangerous moment will come when the side without nuclear weapons begins to near an effective nuclear capability. The temptation for the side that already has nuclear weapons to make a preemptive strike is very strong. It's already happened once. In 1981, Israeli aircraft destroyed Iraq's new nuclear reactor in a surprise attack. The raid was completely successful, and it was relatively safe because Iraq was still a long way from actually building nuclear bombs. But we can expect this sort of situation to come up again and again. If somebody gets the timing wrong, if they attack an enemy who's already secretly built some nuclear weapons and don't manage to destroy all of them, then the result will most likely be a local nuclear war. Both sides will find themselves in a situation where they have to use their nuclear weapons or risk losing them. So they'll probably use them. Goodbye Mecca, goodbye Damascus, goodbye Jerusalem.
At a megaton, I am asking you to try to imagine 80 Hiroshima weapons exploding the same place at the same second. And indeed, even to talk of a megaton is to describe a situation very different from Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They were isolated events in relatively intact societies in which help could come in from the outside. But in any likely scenario today, there will be no outside that we can rely upon. For we have to make the presumption that every other major source of help will be similarly afflicted.
In the case of a nuclear attack, the subway will be affected in every city. All you have to do is explode the right bomb. A ground burst of a powerful bomb will destroy the subway in every city of the world. Water will flood into the subway. Air won't be pumped in. There will be no electricity, and there are no toilets in the subway. Therefore, the subway will become a mass grave.
In reality, of course, few big cities would get hit by only one nuclear weapon. For example, the United States has something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP. It's an attempt to avoid the biggest traffic jam in history of all the West's nuclear forces. Missiles, bombers, submarines, American, British, and French get committed to a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. SIOP allots about 60 nuclear weapons to targets inside Moscow city limits. A reasonable guess that would include one nuclear weapon on the Ministry of Electronic Industries just around that corner, another on Communist Party headquarters behind me, and 4 or 5 big ones on the Kremlin less than half a mile over that way, just to be sure.
I don't know how many warheads the Russians have targeted on New York City, but they'll certainly do the job too.
The direct effects will include second and third degree burns that really represent the charring and barbecuing of human skin and flesh. People up to 35 miles in any direction from the epicenter on a clear day who make a reflex glance at the fireball will suffer a significant risk of retinal burning and blindness. So let me add blindness to a list of injuries that includes ruptured lungs, crushing injuries of the skull, the thorax, crushed extremities, skull fractures, fractures of the long bone, spinal cord lesions. Blast and radiation is worse than either alone. Burn and radiation is far worse than either alone. A dose of 100 rads of external body radiation to a standard burn increases mortality 8-fold. What is left of the buildings is lying in what is left of the streets. There are no hospitals, there are no emergency rooms, there are no operating rooms, there is no blood bank, there is no intravenous fluid, there are no x-ray machines or other diagnostic equipment. We are talking about a physician in the face of these injuries, skull fractures, spinal lesions, crushing injuries of the chest, third-degree burns, running around with a black bag. Medical care is a moderately complex human activity, and it is exactly this kind of moderately complex human activity that will be impossible after a nuclear attack. and will represent perhaps the greatest and most permanent damage. The meaning of survival for human beings is social. And it is the social fabric that will be so ruptured as to change human life for very long periods of time, if not permanently thereafter.
If you were to ask me really seriously what future is there for mankind, I'd be tempted to answer is the future is likely to mankind. I don't say certain. The future likely for mankind is that the whole of mankind will be subjected to nuclear war and other forms of scientific war, even more destructive, and that vast majority of the population of the world everywhere will be destroyed, and then the few remaining, impoverished, crippled, in a poisoned atmosphere, will have to start rather as Noah did after the flood.
We all owe God a death. If we're killed in a nuclear war, what we lose as individuals is a few decades of life. But what the human race loses is the only thing that gives us meaning, the enterprise of civilization. We haven't arrived at our present dilemma by accident or mischance. We were bound to get here eventually because civilization was bound to endow us eventually with the power to destroy ourselves. We're not just responsible for our own fate. We're responsible for all the unborn generations of people down the thousands of years of the future who'll only have a chance, who'll only get born in most cases, if we get it right now. There's nobody wiser than us who'll take the responsibility and solve this problem for us. We have to do it ourselves.